So today on the Ground Jewels, we're joined by Jim Waterson. He is the editor of London Centric, but we're not going to be talking about any of the great football grounds in London, nor any of the great rugby grounds or cricket grounds. We're going to be talking about Bootham Crescent, the former home of York City FC. Jim, welcome to the Ground Jewels.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, Jim is the only guest who has turned up to a recording of the Ground Jewels with a mug of the ground that they're talking about. So I already feel this is going to go particularly well. He's drink. I don't. What are you drinking out of your Bootham Crescent
Uh,
mug?
I, I, I filled it up with water because I'm merely using this as a prop because I'm a terrible media tart who knew that it would look good on a clip. But the reason I brought this mug is I can't actually remember because the pandemic was so strange. But when I was handed this by the old commercial director, he said, I think we need to get rid of these because we're not actually going to be out at the ground by 2020, which is what we had printed on it. And Bootham Crescent, I think, officially closed in 2021, maybe.
Mm.
But I've got both a shirt saying final season 2019 and a mug saying final season 2020. So that shows you what a painful end it was for the ground we're about to discuss.
I very much remember, and it's sort of jumping ahead because I was getting into sort of ground hopping at that time, sort of 2019, and for some reason, the National League North was my favourite sort of league at the time. I was at Boston, which is another ground that doesn't exist anymore, the Jakeman Stadium, and I was watching you guys lose 3-1. And you had that fantastic Y-shaped kit design that season. And
Mm.
that result, along with maybe a game against Hereford, I think, ended up putting you behind, was it South Shields or Kings Lynn on points per game, and you ended up not getting promoted, and it was yeah, painful.
Yeah, York were in National League North at that point, and I always like to use the line. It's a line that is too good to check. I think we were possibly the world's lowest ranked full-time professional football team at one point in National League North. I'm not sure there was anyone else with a full-time squad who was doing mid-tier finishes in the seventh division. Sixth division it would have been, wouldn't it? So,
Yeah.
it was a real low point that. And if you think about where we were then, we were the only team that missed out on promotion due to COVID because when they did the points per game, if one fewer match had been played, one more match had been played and it had averaged out, then we'd have gone straight back up to National League on the averages they used in that first COVID season. And as it was, we had another few years of purgatory playing Curzon Ashton.
Yeah. Well, it's looking up a little bit now, but let's go back to sort of the beginning and sort of find out your sort of York City origin story. And maybe like, so what's your sort of earliest York City memory?
According to my sadly departed mother, she was always annoyed that when she had me in York District Hospital, just over the other side of the railway tracks to Bootham Crescent, that the sound of the first York Scarborough derby was what was annoying her in the afternoon as she tried to have a nap a few days after having me. So that was back in 1989. But I grew up around York. I went to school in York. I overflow with civic pride, despite now living in London and running a London local news outlet. And York, the football club, though, weren't a massive part of my life. I'd be taken to the odd match. Weirdly, the local vicar once took me in about 98. I went to see an England under 21s with a guy called Jermaine Janus playing. I don't know what happened to him. And it was there, but my family weren't into sport, and it wasn't really a thing I regularly went to. But I weirdly was quite obsessively following the club through the local paper. I cared about the results. I cared if they did well. And I remember being in the playground in 1995 when York beat Man United 3-1 away at Old Trafford. And the kids I remember arguing over who got to be York City and who had to be Man United. But I was very nearly a Scarborough fan, and I dodged that narrowly. But really, my visits to Bootham Crescent started quite late when I was about 16, 17. And I'd sort of, because I'd been following York through this era where the ground was sold by the old directors, the club repeatedly nearly went bust. It was saved, and then there was this torturous process of trying to make the sums add up and move to a new ground, which saw the club go to out of the Football League into the conference, which then got renamed several times over. And it was sort of plodding along at this point. It was plodding along. It had been through a lot of financial trouble. It was playing at this wonderfully decrepit 1930s ground that had barely been modernized, bar a few changes to the roof since then. And I just one day, for whatever reason, decided I wanted to go. And I took a mate. He was deeply unimpressed. It was a 5-0 win against Crawley in the National League. And I was just completely hooked on the ground as much as anything. I mean, I couldn't quite remember who was scoring that day, maybe Clayton Donaldson, who was a great player at that time. But it was more the sense of the way that this ground just rose up from the streets around it. It was 5 minutes walk from the centre. You could go for a drink beforehand and then just feel in the sort of stereotypical Lowry-esque way that people were converging on a single point, that the floodlights suddenly popped up, that you entered under this arch. At that point, the arch said Kit Kat Crescent as part of a sponsorship deal with Nestle. And as soon as I stood on the David Longhurst end, the old Shipton Street end, which was the main home terrace, I just loved it because it was it was sort of self-regulating. It was people just drifting around. And if there's one thing I'm going to bang on about in this podcast, I think it's that sense of the group of people coming together and making a place far more than what it is. Objectively, Bootham Crescent was a dump. In reality, it was a beautiful, wonderful place that meant a lot to a lot of people. Doesn't mean it should still be there or be there forever. But some of my best friends I met, as it turned out, from basically turning up on my own some days, walking in, not knowing if anyone was there, pre-smartphone, and just going, "You're right, mate," and then just talking to them. Then they'd introduce me to someone else, and it became a whole new community for me, almost just because it still had terracing and that freedom to move, and people were welcoming, not always welcoming, but usually welcoming. So that's why the ground itself matters so much as the football, because I'm obsessive about the results. I go to as many matches as I can still, but and I've been to 100 odd grounds following York away, but it's that first moment that you walked into Bootham Crescent and it was weird and odd, and there was a rhythm that you felt had been going there for 70, 80 years. That was what hooked me.
Yeah, that feeling of being part of something greater than yourself, but also a little bit more, with more longevity and history than yourself is quite intoxicating when you go into a ground, particularly one which, as you say, looked as I'm trying to be polite, but sort of delightfully rubbish. Delight. It really. It was. It was. Even in the '90s on the TV, when you'd occasionally get sort of like the nationwide highlights and things like that, it looked shit. But I could imagine having a really great time there.
Yeah, I mean, there was one chunky main stand which had everything underneath it. You'd walk in, and there'd be a small car park behind some Victorian terraced houses, squeezed in next to a railway line. There was a sort of gravelly car park with the club offices facing onto it. The executive boxes, which were added in the 80s, faced out onto the car park, not onto the pitch. Um, the turnstiles were belonged in a museum. I think some had come from Old Trafford back from their 1930s ones at some point. You squeezed in, handing over it was in many ways what it was by the end, which was a non-league ground that had seen better days, but it was a hell of a ground in some ways. There was the pop stand, which was the sort of cheaper seated terracing on one side of the pitch, a very low slung stand, which you accessed by buying a ticket to terrace and then paying £1 to transfer. And the away end. I mean, obviously, a lot of people when I talk to them about York talk about being in the away end. Obviously, the look when people mention the away end toilets is something that they've seen things there. And gradually over time, more and more of it was fenced off as the terracing crumbled. Broadly speaking, somehow the peak attendance was something like 28,000. By the end, when you got five or six in there, it felt pretty packed.
Yeah, and I think that those peak attendances came in sort of that big FA Cup runs in '70s and '80s, and in a very much sort of pre-Hillsborough sort of era when we cared a little bit less about the safety of of people going. But you do look back on some of the archive footage, and the club did a really great job when leaving Bootham Crescent of
Mm.
putting together media and eulogizing it and paying tribute. And you see the banking and the number of people in for those huge games, and it's seriously impressive. And I guess what one of my questions is, and you've touched on it a little bit, is it's not thought of as a particularly sort of sporty town. It's got, it's got the race course and it's got the club. You're a little bit maybe too genteel or too academic or, to even though you're in that sort of Yorkshire area, you're not seen as sort of a rugby league area, although I know that your current ground is shared with a rugby league. So what was it about you that sort of made you want to gravitate towards that and then feel that sense of place and sense of belonging when you did?
I really have a sort of odd relationship with York. I love it to bits. For whatever reason, I've ended up not living there, but it is a city that people often get wrong if they're not from there.
Mm,
There's sort of two cities, and one is maybe squeezing the other out at the moment. You've got the middle class city that is the one that people talk about when they go for a weekend away. It's, oh, aren't the streets delightful? We got an Airbnb and we had a posh dinner. And that was also the university element, the church, which was a really strong influence, owned a lot of land in the centre. And then around the edge, you had what was basically a northern manufacturing town. It made railways, it made chocolate, it made glass. You you had things being made there. And so there's always been a tension in York until pretty recently when one side has kind of won out. That it used to be known as pretty and poor, um, and now it's pretty and wealthy. And the people who would be on the terraces at York in the past, who might have been working at Nestle or working on the carriage works, building trains for British Rail. Now you're as likely to find someone who is associated with the uni, or family of the older crowd. But it's a changing city, and there's an interesting tension there in terms of the attitude towards Bootham Crescent, who'd come and who's now coming to the new ground that's an out of town one. And it reflects the way that York's changing a lot. Is what sort of city is it going to be? Is it going to be a place where you could you could live a life on a decent but average salary, or is it a place that's going to be kind of more of an elitist middle class kind of place? So, there's a lot of tensions wrapped up with what the club is and how that's represented. And a thing I want to talk about also is this way, sort of the idea that the club has changed in the last few years along with the city.
It's your podcast as much as much as mine, Jim. So don't feel these things work best when I'm doing about 20% of the talking and you're doing about 80%. So don't stop me from any tangents that you want to go off on. So that's absolutely fine. Um, when we were speaking before recording, you were sort of you were saying you didn't have a sort of great memory for specific games, in terms of you more sort of picking up and memories are attached to sort of feelings and sentiments rather, not got that instant recall of perhaps the trivia of football, which some people do. So when you started going, what was your sort of match day experience like? You said you went with a friend initially who wasn't impressed. Were you were you a solo fan who would like find your tribe there, or was there a sort of a match day ritual and routine where you go with the same people, meet up at a certain point? Is there anything, presumably very relating to the age that you were, and I don't know if you're walking or getting public transport all the time, but how was your initial sort of match day experience?
So I grew up in the countryside near York, and then ended up moving into the city when my parents moved there when I was about 17. So it's all wrapped up in that. Really, suddenly, a place that we'd looked to became actually home. And I would walk across this medieval city. You'd go for a pint at the Minster Inn. which was nearby, and then you'd be able to run down. And my parents ended up living quite near to the ground, so especially when I moved away, it was an easy run. I could run out of work at 5 o'clock in London, catch a train, uh, run past my parents' house, drop my bag, and just about make it in time for an evening kickoff if I wanted to. Um, it really it was about sort of the sense of where the ground was in the city as much that was the appeal for
Mm.
me, and that sense of people converging. There was, some of my best mates who I've met through going to York matches. You got to know them. I ended up doing ticket sales on the 50-50 draw at the gates on some days. There was a time that I got involved in fundraising for the youth team, and organised a gig by the comedian Richard Herring at the social club, which was in many ways a bit of a disaster, but left me with many memories that I'll never forget. Not least when I accidentally locked him in the boardroom, with no lights because I couldn't find the light switch. And then he had to go and perform his sort of more risque set to a room of mainly youth team parents and grandparents who bought tickets under duress. And I think sort of wanted something, not quite sure it's the comedy that they were after, but we raised a few grand for the youth team because Herring had always sort of claimed to be a York fan and made jokes about it, but never really been to a match. So somewhere on YouTube there's a video of me taking him to a match, him laughing at how terrible the ground was, and then doing his gig afterwards. But it's bits like that I remember, and also, um, when we were talking about the sort of great cup nights, having Everton, Liverpool, Arsenal come there. Sure, I heard about that. I learned about that from the older fans. But for me, it was something like being in the FA Trophy semi-final and beating AFC Telford, and then meaning we got to go to Wembley. Now, obviously, that's not going to be a great match if you watched it back, if it's still on YouTube. But that sense of having made a new group of friends, having been in that away and having gone up through all the away matches on that run and knowing we were going to Wembley when that was still an exciting thing. And for whatever reason, I'd asked the DJ, if we make it through, could you, I was really into New Order at that point. Could you put New Order by Temptation on? I'll give like 10 quid to charity. Because he was sort of basically saying, if you want any records playing and you give some donation to charity, put on. So in a sort of like terrible millennial staged teenage drama, I was running onto the pitch to celebrate us beating AFC Telford while New Order's Temptation was blaring out. I don't know what on earth I was thinking. Maybe I was imagining the camera panning around or something. But that was, my father-in-law always said that it's I'm more of a York fan than a football fan, and I think that's accurate. The bits that stick in the mind are those pushing for promotion from the conference, and then finally achieving it, where we'd have the world's lankiest player, Richard Brodie, somehow inexplicably up front scoring 30 odd goals a season, or the now sadly departed Craig Farrell, or players who were just absolutely uh, kind of not brilliant in themselves, but quite interesting, flawed individuals, and I ended up doing all the interviews for the club program, and getting very involved very very quickly, and setting up all the club social media before anyone knew what social media was. And that was the bit that appealed to me, the sense that this matters to so much, and I want what they're having, and the football I got hooked on almost afterwards.
Yeah, I can see it. I can see it being incredibly intoxicating. And that point about civic pride and being a fan of the town and using the sort of town to sort of advocate the club to advocate for the town is really powerful. I remember one of my favourite football memories as well is it's an FA Trophy or is it an FA Vase? I don't know, one of the two, probably Trophy, maybe Vase. But when Spennymoor Town uh, got to Wembley and we played Tunbridge Wells. And you can probably tell from my accent that it doesn't sound like I'm from Durham, but but half the family is from Durham, and I got to go with my dad, and that's the side of the family that is from that part of the world. And it's just the whole of this tiny town in Durham, just decamping down to London for the big day. Helped that we won 2-1 as well, and it's just that kind of really sort of proud moment where You feel like you're getting, you feel like you're getting your moment in the sun, and it is really nice, as a fan of, a smaller team, to have those moments, that day at Wembley, the promotion, whatever it is. And I think it kind of puts, if you have that and if you get that, it puts all the drudgery and the negativity and the uncertainty, which definitely comes along with being a non-league fan, or a fan of a lower league team at the time, into perspective, and it gives it the relief from that. Because God knows there's been enough of that, at York over the years.
Right, and the potted history for those who don't want to load up Wikipedia is basically that York were plodding along as a sort of League One-ish club for many years. The old directors in the late '90s sold out the ground. The sold it to a complete chancellor called John Batchelor, who briefly renamed it a soccer club, and talked big, but absolute. Um, I'll choose my words carefully because it's not good to speak ill of the deceased. But he didn't leave the club in a good way. The fans rescued it. The fans struggled to run it, and it ended up owned by a local packaging merchant who spent most of his time trying to find a new ground, which ended up being a struggle in itself. So you had this asset that was already neglected in about 2000, which by 2 decades later was really showing its age, because everyone knew there was no point spending any money on it, but at the same time, it still needed to be kept up to a serviceable standard. And there was this wonderful moment when I got involved entirely by chance. I just happened to turn up at the time that this was happening. A guy called Mike Palfrey and a person who would go on to be the godfather of my child, Tom Feeney, and they were involved with a group called the Jorvik Reds. And bizarrely, at this point, that sort of Italian tifo flares culture hadn't really taken root in the UK. Now you go into any non-league match and there's kids setting off flares and all of that. But at that point, there was basically Crystal Palace and York who were doing it. And I must admit, I always remember the Holmesdale fanatics sent up someone to see what York were doing as a sort of guest. And I think was slightly baffled by what they were seeing and why people cared about this terrible quality of football. But you go to a York game at that point, and there might be 2,000 or 3,000 people there, but in the home end would be the most elaborate banners that these young teenagers and early 20-somethings had spent their time making. You'd have a guy drumming away. You'd have someone who'd pulled it all together. There would be confetti and streamers flying through the air. It mattered because it was so bizarre to see it it would look great at Napoli. It looked very strange on the terraces at York, and that was all part of it. It was a real moment for the club. Which sadly was crushed by a lot of worries about safety officers. A few years later, and it would have been all over social media, and it would have brought in a whole new set of fans. But at the time, it sort of was just something that happened in the ground.
Yeah, it's really interesting because when you think of English and tifo, you do go to Crystal Palace. I didn't know that about York, um, and it's, yeah, you've got, wow, that's really interesting because you had the it made me instantly, and no one's probably made this instant connection between York and the San Siro before, but you're talking, you've got like the Curva Nord there in the San. Did you? Did you Oh, it's just, you've got that, the not the Shipton Street end, but the what's the traditionally away. It is like a crescent, isn't it? With the standing, where the, not is, so it's the wrong tense, was the, where the away fans would stand. There was that sort of curved end there. But you were in the Shipton Street end, weren't you, doing all of that stuff?
Yeah,
Sorry.
and I mean any curve on the street was more of a sort of, I think it was usually a wall that was at risk of collapsing at any moment and crushing anyone who was around it. I mean, it was not in a good shape by the end. I mean, the theory, talking to some local historians in any case, was that, and this goes back to the sense of it, is that the crescent of Bootham Crescent, when it was laid out on a field, which was formerly a cricket pitch, the crescent of the name would have been basically the ancient field boundary from medieval times, and that itself would have probably been shaped by where an oxen would have turned at the end of doing its time with a plough. So that sense in York, my parents lived nearby a few streets away and built a house in York, and they found 4 Roman burials under the kitchen. I mean, it's that kind of city. You put a spade in the ground and you're going to find weird old stuff. And that, who knows how many Romans once kicked a bladder around on the site of what was Bootham Crescent. Things are just everywhere in York, and the connection goes back always further than you realise.
It's really interesting, and I think there's something as well in terms, there's definitely something in terms of having that young, energetic fan base, not having that sort of those sort of in a big club, you've got the layers of bureaucracy. Whereas if you're at a small, you can, like you do, talk to the DJ and got your song play, or talk to someone who's just sort of, you feel like you can do it because there's no there's no supporters trust liaison officer or something like that. It's just like you've got that close connection to each other, and you've got the close connection to the ground and the community, and you can express yourself in these brilliant ways. Um,
It doesn't half attract some moaners though at the same time. When the stakes are
well, there's
lower,
some
people
oddballs.
do love to gripe about the tiny bits as well. So, if you ever sat by the main stand where some of the older fans were, the abuse that you'd hear from the mouths of a 75-year-old who'd been coming for 6 decades, oh, it was like nothing else.
Yeah, no one likes change. We know this. We know this. This is a universal truth. But I think it's brilliant, and I think it's one of those. It's one of those. I've got this lovely image now, and I wish. I mean, I don't know if you got any image, but I wonder if there is any sort of archive imagery of that we could kind of put out with the episode, any sort of old photos, or I know there might not be like, but yeah, even as just a little snippet, that would be fantastic to see.
Well, there's an extraordinary photographer called Tony Cole who it's not his day job, but he's done 3 series of books, 3 books on York City, all in black and white, and they are just an incredible set of photos, regardless of whether you're interested in York or not. If you're just listening to this and you're interested in football culture, see if Tony's books are still available and in print because they capture the last days of Bootham Crescent like nothing else.
Mm,
And if I had that 5 or 6 years where I was popping back the whole time, I'd moved away for university, but I'd try and get back up as much as I could. I'd come back up for all the big matches. We got promoted. We won at Wembley twice in a week in 2012. Where we won both the FA Trophy and the league playoff final. During that era, bizarrely, our big rivals, because York has never really had a proper local rival other than Scarborough, um, the big rivals were Luton Town, and we kept beating them, and it was great. When they would hate us. There was an away match where Tommy Robinson and the EDL tried to attack our fans with brooms. But we were beating Luton. We were the 2 big ex-league clubs that were going head to head in
mm,
non-league, and we were coming up on top. Of course, they slightly overtook us, and while we ended up in Conference North, they were pushing for promotion to the Premier League. Uh, but there was that glorious era, and then we sort of had another push where future England goalkeeper Nick Pope almost got us into League One, and then it all went to pieces. And within a few years of getting promotion and going, okay, we got this now. We're a lower league club. We're going to be fine. We was back in Conference North. Well, not back in Conference North, in Conference North for the first time ever. And I really think a lot of people kind of had enough or cut back on going at that point because it was just, oh, I thought we'd escape this. And not only did we get back into non-league, we've gone straight back out the other end and we're playing at basically fenced off 3G pitches in community centres. It just wasn't fun. The ground
mm.
was rubbish, the football was rubbish, and there was no sign of it getting any better. And that's really the sadness of the end of this story is that where Bootham Crescent was by the end. My big memories of the end are things like a match against, I think it was Forest Green, where we needed to win and we didn't. And the silence when it was just, oh my goodness, we're going to regional football. We're going to regional football. Um, and the fans who turned out in their thousands were then in the car park barracking the directors in those executive boxes facing the car park. It was a really nasty atmosphere, and then we didn't even get to say goodbye to the ground.
Yeah. because a lot of clubs have this moment. There's Mansfield near me went into the conference, and now they're right at the top of League One, and they use it as a moment to reset. And yeah, it took you guys a while, but you get the promotion back to the Football League. So, and at that point, normally, say normally, usually you've got these examples like like I said, Mansfield, but Lincoln as well, and Luton to a certain extent. And looking what's Wrexham, Notts County, recent examples, and they go, okay, now we know what went wrong. We're not going to let that happen again. But what's that sort of that fan base experience when you go through that trauma for a second time? Because I mean, the truth is, and I'm getting this as a Birmingham City fan. Sometimes going down a division can be really fun, especially if you've been struggling. It brings people out of the woodwork because actually people don't want to go and watch a team be absolutely rubbish and scrape out draws and get to 50
Mm.
points and survive on the last day. They quite like going down and beating up on some teams that are a little bit smaller than them because it feels good and it brings, it's nice to watch a winning side. But then when you feel, well, yeah, there's this, yeah, but then you dropping through that must be like galling.
And I'd never really thought about it like this until you said that. But I suppose every workplace maybe has the person who's been moved sideways to a non-job. Congratulations,
Mm,
John. Yeah, we sort of feel it's time for you to become head of paper clips, and everyone's like, "Well, he used to be great. We keep him on the payroll, and it's nice that he's still here, and we'll make sure he gets an invite to the work drinks. And could you talk to him for a bit because he's a bit lonely?" God, it started to feel a bit like that being York in Conference North or whatever. When people are like, "How are you doing?" It's like, no, we're still rubbish. No, I mean it's not like a fun rubbish. It's not sort of rebuild rubbish. No, no, we're actively just plodding along, going for a mid-table finish in Conference North. Um, and it wasn't clear that there would be an easy way out of that. Even the Conference North to Conference promotion was achieved. I mean, skin of teeth doesn't quite cover it. I mean, snuck into the playoffs right at the death. Then we're incredibly lucky with a run of matches, and then got promoted. But I'm getting ahead of myself because that was the thing that made the new stadium have some sort of personality. And we're here to talk about Bootham Crescent and its sort of strange decay at the end of the 2010s.
yeah, we can. So how do you want to do it? Because the very end is very sad for me, because you have this opportunity to sort of say goodbye. It's planned to be the last season. I think that gets sort of pushed and delayed a little bit, so you have a couple of these last seasons. But there would be people who probably be York fans, maybe as far away as Australia or whatever, would have been like, "Well, it means a lot. I'm going to make sure I'm back." Whether it's going to be at the very final game or get back and see it, one last time. And you have this season where you're going relatively well. I think you're going very well up until Christmas. You're leading the National League North. It feels like it could be a fitting send off to the old ground. And then this thing happens in Wuhan. I think we start hearing about COVID in sort of December, January, and then by March you you're in everyone's off work and you guys you're squabbling with Kings Lane fans on messaging boards about points per game. And people
Yeah,
who, yeah, so go ahead.
it was rubbish. I mean, there was quite a lot going on in the world at that point. I mean, there's two political campaigns I've been involved with in York. First was back at the 2010 general election. Before if you remember, the Lib Dems got in a lot of trouble by signing big pledge cards saying we won't raise
Mm.
tuition fees. Before
And
they
Lincoln
realised that
signed a
was
few of them.
a trap. I got every candidate standing for election in York to pose with one saying, "I will build York a new ground and secure its future," which had ended up sort of for a brief period running basically a lobbying campaign for a new ground. Weirdly, I then realised how much I loved Bootham Crescent and deeply regretted it, but I thought I was helping to save the club and in a tiny way maybe might have nudged the council and others to commit to building a new ground that meant at least there is still a club there. And then the second was this COVID season where I was working at The Guardian as a journalist and had been for quite a while and got the word got around a few MPs that I was a York fan, and there were two MPs, neither of them actually anywhere near York. The MP for Peterborough and the MP for Alan Mack, somewhere in Hampshire, who were like, we need to make sure York can play its playoff matches in Conference North. And DCMS were like, there's a pandemic on, we're only allowing good football to happen because that'll keep people happy. And York fans lobbying and using these MPs and the club and all this stuff. And they tried to get me to sort of write something about it. I was like, I cover the media industry, it's not really relevant. But some poor civil servant had to go and sign off a change in the law to COVID restrictions to allow Conference North and South playoffs to take place, purely to try and get York promoted. And do you know what happened? We absolutely blew it in the first match. So at that point, we thought maybe the last ever Bootham Crescent match was a defeat to Altrincham, with Guy Mowbray commentating, with the fans only allowed to watch over a stream, having had the law changed specifically to allow it to go ahead. And that is that shows you how much people care about a club like York.
Yes.
And
So
in the end, go on, sorry.
I was going to say, would that have been Stuart Jackson?
Yeah, it was no, sorry, not Stuart Jackson. Ed, you can edit this out. He's a nice guy, and I should be able to remember his name. It was Paul. The Peter MP was Paul Bristow, who really went out of his way. He's not from York, but he's a massive York supporter, and you still see him at games. He was a Tory MP for Peterborough, and he basically pulled in every favour to make sure that York could play in playoffs in the middle of the pandemic.
That's one of the better bits of COVID corruption I've heard about.
I mean, absolutely love it, and I think he'd be proud of hearing his name and that story told, rather than it's all embarrassed. So I hope he knows that was a good legacy of having him in the governing party.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly seems more defensible than Cheltenham races in March 2020. So that's fine. But then you get this sort of reprieve, or sort of semi-reprieve, because the York Community Stadium's not ready, or I forget the exact story about. So you're going to play another season. Then there's a second wave of restrictions, aren't there? And in your and I remember the gate grounds were being limited to like 25% of their capacity or something like that, depending on the tier you were in. And it's just, and yeah. So how did the final end for Bootham Crescent happen?
There was some match, God knows what it was. I think the league was even abandoned in the end that year, where
Mm.
500 or so York fans were allowed in. And it was this massive effort to, make sure everything was sanitized and everyone was sitting 3 seats apart. And I almost wish it hadn't happened in some way. I'm sure it's great for those people who got to go and take a picture, but it wasn't the final match at Bootham Crescent, because that didn't happen. That
Mm.
was, there was a game that was, I think, scrubbed from the record books, where 500 people sat around and watched some players play, but that wasn't the last match at Bootham Crescent. The last match at Bootham Crescent was the one that took place just before the restrictions came in 2020, where York were looking to push for promotion, and it was, can we do a send off to the old ground? All the ideas that there'd always been talk of maybe getting Shed 7, a local York band, to play a goodbye gig, that we'd do some big send off. That if COVID hadn't been there, there would definitely have been people like myself who don't get to every home match by any means, but would be begging and clearing the diary to make sure they could come back for the final match and be in that crowd. It would have been a total sellout, and it would have been really nice. It would have been a sort of we all learned a lot about grieving and memory in that era, and it would have been a lovely thing, but it didn't happen. And instead, in a sort of strange way, we just sort of one day popped up at this quite bland, out of town stadium, and the doors on Bootham Crescent and the gates were bolted shut, and it just kind of ended. And it was
Mm.
there. There were a few fan matches played where people paid for the right, and at least 24 people claimed to have scored the last goal at Bootham Crescent. But that was it. We were out. We were at the LNER Community Stadium a very functional but distinctly council-built facility on the edge of town. Um, I'll talk a bit after this about what that's done to the club because I just want to close out the Bootham Crescent bit. But
Mm,
if you think about the efforts that a lot of clubs go to manage the transition to a new ground, whether it's the goodbye to the old one, the come and see your seat at the new ground, none of that was possible because of the lockdown. Um, and essentially, just one day the lights were switched off at one place, and one day the lights were switched on without fans at the other. And it's taken a lot to rebuild what I almost think is now a new club, in some ways at the new ground, and something was lost with the loss of Bootham Crescent that will never come back, and that's not necessarily unhealthy, but it's a shame that there was never really a definitive moment where that happened.
yeah, I think absolutely. I think there's a grounds have natural life cycles. And we know the pressures of on land and other uses, notably housing, etc. But they're so important to people that if you are going to move, it needs to be for good reasons, and it needs to be done properly. You can, um, I think people would generally prefer not to move. They like what they like, and there's a reason they've become fans and they've been drawn to that place in the first place. But I think very much, clubs being sort of custodians and sort of representatives of their city, they have the obligation to do well by their fans, because it's ultimately their customers. We hate using the word customer, but they're their lifeblood. You've got, if you treat fans well, then fans will reward, pay that back tenfold. And obviously certain things are out of their hand, but it does feel sort of, it feels galling for people, because there's lots. We've talked about COVID a lot on this podcast. There's teams that were able to that won for the first time in a long time. Rangers being a great example,
Mm.
Leeds being a great example, won in that COVID
Wickham as
season.
well, yeah.
Liverpool weren't able to celebrate properly, but that's bad. But not being able to grieve properly feels a lot worse. And I know there was much worse going on in terms of grieving and COVID restrictions, and in the real world. But for more the small parochial bit of the world of football architecture, which this podcast concerns itself with, this is a huge deal. And yeah, in many ways, the new ground, it was is will have facets of it that are definitely superior in terms of facilities. You're going to have women's rugby World Cup matches there next year as part, and that'll be great. And certainly wouldn't have been bringing those games to York and if Bootham Crescent was the ground. So that, there are positives with new developments, but it is sad. There is, you do lose something as well.
I had my first kid at the start of the pandemic, and the sort of the annoyance that I just was never going to be able to say that I'd taken him even as a in a buggy to Bootham Crescent. So I've got one picture of him standing outside the locked gates of Bootham Crescent, crying his eyes out because I was trying to make him pose, and it looks like a sort of Martin Parr photo of a sort of poor 70s child being forced to stand on a cold, windy seaside or something. It's quite the picture. But my final ever visit to Bootham Crescent was after a chat with, I probably won't name them, but they know who they are if they're listening to this, who had told me when I was said I'd love to have just seen inside one final time, because English Heritage were doing, it was considered such an oddity, this 1930s ground, that English Heritage did an incredible project to really document it and dig it up and do archaeology on a football ground, so it was recorded for posterity. And there's an incredible body of work that they did, aided by the fact that York has a strong archaeological community. And The Guardian, my colleague at the time, Lexi Topping, did an incredible write-up of it. So if you Google York Historic England, I think it was Historic England who did it. Then there's some stuff there. But I was tipped off that there was maybe a way into the ground. And one night when I was staying at my parents', I slipped out, and it was very, very dark. It was about 9 at night, except there was a very bright moon that night. And got up to the gates, and I'm a scrawny person, and I just managed to slip around the fence that they'd put over the main entrance. And I'd been told that if you jimmied up the fire escape to the main stand and took a bit of a leap of faith, you could end up on the roof of the old social club and clamber into the ground, which I did. And there was a moment, because it started to rain and it got a bit slippy on that roof, that I started to realize that there was a headline forming in my head: Guardian journalist found dead in mysterious circumstances at defunct football ground, that was going to be my legacy. But I just about made it into the main stand, which had been smashed up a bit by some vandals, but was still basically the same seats and the same place that if you'd been there in the 1930s, you'd have recognized. And I walked round the ground one final time for about 20 minutes, and I stood at the back of the Longhurst on my own, and I just sat there on the, I think you can be prone to rhapsodizing a bit too much about football grounds, but that sense of being in a place that I had only known as something that got its meaning from people being there, from being full, from
Mm.
having the crowd flow. I'd been in basically crushes on that stand when goals were scored, and just being there on my own was so unnerving, because it was genuinely ghostly, because you could feel that the person who'd stood there on exactly the same terrace in the 30s, and their son who'd been there in the 60s, and then their grandson or whatever. Even the old woman was allowed, I believe. So apologies for gendering that one, but you get what I mean. That sense that people had been coming here from this city for a long time, um, and now it was nothing. It was gone. And there was a tunnel under the pop stand that I snuck into, which used to be used until the 70s for switching ends. And there was still graffiti from that time. I think there was some Bradford Park Avenue fan graffiti, and that really dates it. And I'll be honest, by the end, I was absolutely shit scared. I was getting when you're in a place and no one knows you're there and you're on your own. And actually, by that point, I was starting to wondering, well, I jumped down a couple of meters to get into here. How am I going to get back out, and how
Mm.
am I going to explain this to anyone? But wandering around it was honestly one of the most extraordinary things I've ever done, in terms of a place that I knew in one sense, and instead just being there, lit up by the moon, trying to capture it in my head for one final time. And in some ways, that's the memory of that sticks strongest in my head now. That final visit back, and compartmentalizing all the stuff that I'd seen there, all the fun I'd had. Whether it was a football match, or the time I went to see Frank Sidebottom play in the social club in one of the funniest gigs I'd ever been to, or the time I'd been helping the club out with social media there, um, and all the friends I'd met there, and knowing that I'd never, ever, ever see it again. And then I just slipped back out, and it was gone. And that was the end of Bootham Crescent for me personally. And the end of the club in a certain form. My life had changed. I was living in London, um, and the new ground wasn't quite the same thing. And it's a different club now. It's a different thing, and it serves a different purpose. And if you go to Bootham Crescent now, you'll find Persimmon, who have been waiting for 2 decades to develop it, are putting up a load of perfectly functional, Persimmon homes. They've kept a little bit of one of the old stands, so there'll be a nice memorial garden. Because of course, one of the weirdest things was some people had their ashes scattered or
Yeah, I
buried
saw
by the
that.
side of the pitch. So you don't just move a football ground; you've got to basically, um, you know, is anyone's grandpa buried here? Could you get back in
Well,
touch if you know grandpa's here? And
you've
other
got to
things, like
exhume a
there was
few
a
people, haven't you? It's,
literally, it's not just the people who are stuck on main stand season tickets. You literally had to dig up some of them. And then there was the question of, what do you do with all the bits of the ground? Well, there was a building for the future wall where people had bought bricks, which started to collapse during our time in the conference. And every time you turned up to a match, the building for the future wall had lost a few bricks that were shattered on the ground. Um, and everything was then auctioned off in an incredible auction that was done not on eBay in a way that would be sensible, but by a blind auction, where it was just paper bid, and every item, whether it was the urinals or whether it was the signs from all around the pitch, you had to guess not only how much you were willing to pay, but which idiot would be willing to bid a certain amount, and can you bid a pound more? And there was a lot of people of a certain era who ended up paying way over the odds for total trash, including myself. So I have a giant sign from the family area of Bootham Crescent at the end of my garden saying, please don't swear in this family area. Anyone will be kicked out if they break the rules, which unfortunately I've been made to put in the shed because apparently it ruins the vibe of the nice garden. But
To say,
all over the country now are turnstiles and random signs and bits like that. There's a production company in York who make TV called Button Down, and if you go into their office, it's part TV production company and part a recreation of Bootham Crescent with all sorts of bits of memorabilia in a museum. And I always thought, in some ways, the case for keeping Bootham Crescent would be almost as a living museum, a bit like Beamish up near
mm,
Durham, that you could take kids on a school trip. I know you're a Liverpool fan, Jono, but this is what football used to look like. That was almost the best case for staying at Bootham Crescent, literally as a museum piece. But York's got a lot of museums, and York is changing. York maybe needed to change. I think it's a desperately sad thing that we couldn't find sites for a ground in the city centre. There was constant talk of putting it by the railway station or by the racecourse, and instead it's ended up at the world's blandest shopping centre with a terrible public transport link and people driving there. And the worst thing about the move to the new stadium?
they got promoted.
No, that was great. The worst thing about the new stadium is the public bloody love it. Attendances are
Ah,
through the roof. There's a whole new generation of fans. There's a youthfulness around the club and an energy around the club. It is objectively not what I signed up for as a York fan, and it is a roaring success. And that's challenging me. That's challenging me because it doesn't have the terracing behind the goal. It doesn't have that ability for someone like me to just turn up, wander in, and know because York are underperforming and there's this decaying old ground that you can just slip in and get to know people. Instead, it's attracted that post-COVID attendance boom. Means that and the ability to drive to it and the ability to know that it's not a deeply unpleasant place to sit and you can actually the views from the stands are better. I think the matchday experience is enormously lacking. You have to dodge the crowds going for kids swimming lessons, and there's nowhere to get a pint. The service for the food is beyond abysmal, but the club is thriving there in a way that it wouldn't have done and couldn't have done without a massive rebuild of Bootham Crescent. And that ultimately, I think that probably matters more, that there are a load of 12 and 13-year-olds who wouldn't even remember the Conference North years, who started going post-COVID because their mates were going, and have built a whole new culture around the club. There's been a takeover by a guy called Matt Ugler and his mother, who are from a very wealthy background, but he's quite an intriguingly modest guy in the sense that he clearly wanted a project. He's not pouring in the cash to an incredible degree. He made an awful lot of mistakes early on, but he is basically building a new club at a new stadium. And it's not the club I got into in the 2000s. It's a different club, and that's healthy because it shouldn't be me down in London going, I'd love to take a trip back up to the thing that I remember because that's deep nostalgia for when I was going out all night and it was a lot more fun. Um, I think it's really great that there's a load of kids in the South Stand at the new ground who are building their own culture, memories, and having a great time with it. I still go when I'm up, but it's their club now, and I think that's really healthy.
it must feel different, and as you say, necessarily different, and not necessarily, and not different equals bad type thing. But going back now, do do you are you sort of a bit distant from it? Are you has it affected your love of the club, or do you just go, okay, this is a different match day experience, And philosophically, in the round, I'm fine with it, even though I'm not enjoying it as much. Or does it mean that you're now not looking for that result at 4:45 on a Saturday quite as much?
Oh, no, I'm obsessed. I'm still, and certainly at the moment I go to. There's a lot of southern teams. I go to a lot of the away matches, and then when I'm up, I'll go to a home match. My poor children, growing up in inner London, are having to run around the playground in York shirts. They got taken to Biggleswade away the other week. I've taken them to Wealdstone,
Oh,
Solihull. I was probably the only person at our crucial relegation decider in Solihull with a 12-month-old on my lap.
my friend
The
Mark was there. He was there. He's a York fan. He lives in Nottingham, but he went for that one. So yeah, it's there's a few of
and
you.
York, because of the demographics of York, and it's got a strong educational kind of thing, and a lot of people are from York, and so there's often an enormous turnout for away games. I remember going to a Tuesday night at Bromley, and the announcer saying, thanks so much to the sort of 300 or 400 York fans who came all the way down. And I looked around and I think, well, I think I know at least half of you, and I'm pretty sure most of you are going back to Zone Three. uh, it has
From
a
north of the river.
potential fan. Exactly, there's a potential fan base for York that's way beyond the home crowds, but suddenly you're seeing near sellouts at the LNER.
Mm,
You're seeing 6, 7,000. They were lucky to get 3,000 even on good runs at Bootham Crescent. There's a guy called Frank Ormston who's been involved in the club for years, and he's got a similar thing. I saw him tweet the other day that he's turning 60, and he often felt at Bootham Crescent like he was one of the younger ones there. You can't make people get into something that is just not what they expect. And for better or worse, unfortunately, trying to convince kids of today to go and do visit what's basically a museum piece didn't work. And there is something about the LNER and the new ground that works for them. I hate the fact that, I mean, A, it's no longer right next door to my parents' house, and B, I can't roll into York Station and be there 10 minutes later. Instead, I have to sort of borrow a bike or walk for the best part of an hour. Um, I think the match day experience is severely lacking, but it clearly works for a lot of people.
mm,
And that's what I mean. There is a new club that is being formed, one that works well, is well run, has money, and is looking for promotion at a new ground. And that reinvention, I can't say anything other than how is that not healthy? There's so much that could be done to improve the new ground. And if anyone goes as an away fan, they'll quite quickly spot the things that they're lacking, and the things that, if only at the planning stage a bit more thought had gone into it, and it hadn't been
mm,
a local authority running the process, but actually the football club, then you could have made it so much better. And it's still pretty basic. It has more in common with something that was built in the 2000s, like Burton Albion's ground, than it does with um, some of the places that have similar capacity. But
mm,
we are where we are. It's been built. It's going to be the home. Hopefully, some money can be spent on it. Maybe at some point the Ooglers could get ownership of it and improve it themselves. But whether it's the rugby league team, whether it's the women's rugby league team who are playing there, it's home to uh, in, you know uh, internationals and things like that. Annoyingly and infuriatingly, Leeds under 21 keep playing there. And that is a major bone of contention with York fans. Because, of course, I think technically the last ever match at Bootham Crescent was a Leeds under 21 match that then got mysteriously cancelled when the fans went, "What the hell are you doing?" Um, actually, I'm just going to check that. I just want to check if that was the final match, and then we can just you can slot that in.
I
Um,
mean,
uh,
we can.
well, you can edit. You can edit
It's a
around that.
day for it's
Uh,
a day for fake news, Jim. I think we're recording this on the 6th of November. We're allowed to lie a little. This is Jim's big lie that Leeds under 21s played the
yeah,
last game
yeah.
at Bootham Crescent.
Um, but the I'm pretty sure that's the case. But if you think about what I just need to check this. Oh my God, we haven't mentioned the Nazis. How
Well,
have we not
that's
mentioned
a
the
clip.
Nazis?
That is a clip that we're going to use for social media. Good job you don't work for the Guardian anymore, Jim.
one of
So
the
what's
okay,
what
you've got to
what
slot this
how
in at some point.
is this the Nazis in the Bootham Crescent was used for a war film or something like that? Was it was
there was there is an incredible thread which I hope you can link to in the comments or anything else that goes out with this called the York City Banter Era, which was put together by a friend of mine called Ben. And in it, he basically does this incredible run of totally preposterous, very tin pot things that happened to York during the 2010s. And one of the absolute best was when I can't even stop laughing when some photographer turned up at the ground one day on a tip that Bootham Crescent had been covered in swastikas and Hitler was wandering around. And a Bollywood film about the Indian field hockey's team's triumph at the 1936 Olympics was being filmed at Bootham Crescent. And without telling any of the fans, someone at the club had taken a few grand. And there was just all these stormtroopers and Waffen SS and Hitler and giant swastika banners behind the away end, not the away end, behind the main stand. And just the photos, if you Google York City Bootham Crescent Nazis, that you will find are. I mean, imagine not telling the fans that this was happening and then everyone just seeing, well, I know we've had our problems with the chairman in the past, but what is going on here? It was one of those all time great. How has the club allowed this to happen? Moments. Why? Why? What is going on? How are we so short on money that we've just allowed the ground to be pictured covered in swastikas?
but I mean that's obviously your concern. My concern is that Bootham Crescent looks nothing like, you know, 90. Well, I presupposed that the hockey was played in the main stadium. I guess it wouldn't have been played in the main stadium. I don't
I
know.
did. I did
It
once
was in the
find. I
Olympia
did.
Stadion. Bootham Crescent's nothing like the Olympia Stadion in Berlin.
Clearly, the viewers of this Bollywood hit, I'm not sure if it ever reached much of an audience, had no idea that they were actually looking at a Northern English football ground in its dying days. Chesterfield Saltergate got used for the damned United. York City's got used for a triumph over fascist field hockey players.
So, yeah, wow. the yeah, wow. The good news is the Indians do beat the Nazis in 1936. Wikipedia is telling me.
Good.
So I don't know what the moral of that is, but yeah. Wow, this is I didn't expect the Nazis to come up. I'm going to be honest, Jim. I do apologise. I'm taken slightly aback. I think we'll leave it in just as it is. I think it's too good not to. I don't know if I'm going to be able to go back and find a seamless place for it somewhere earlier in the episode. So it might just be the last word on Bootham Crescent might be we didn't even mention the Nazis and we leave
We
it there.
didn't even mention the Nazis. I think in some ways we didn't even mention the Nazis, and it is a perfect example of the strange stories that attach themselves to these places, and the fact that people were offended, baffled, or just bemused by that turning up says everything you know about supporting a lower league football club, and quietly in some ways why it's delightful because something like that just happens and it becomes part of the folklore, in the same way that some the older people would talk about the one-legged hooligan Terry Exelby from the 80s who was a York fan who would sometimes pass his leg down the crowd or whatever. For my generation it's do you remember the day the Nazis turned up, and I think kind of that's kind of why these places matter way more than the bricks and the mortar, um, uh, or indeed, uh, or
And
indeed, it's sometimes even the football.
they matter for the stories, and that's the thing, isn't it? It's the stories that attach themselves to our lives, by being in this place or being associated with this place. And sometimes the stories are great, and sometimes they're Nazis.
Sometimes they're Nazis. Sometimes they're Nazis, but I do just recommend that the juxtaposition of the "Welcome to Bootham Crescent" sign and the mini Hitlers wandering around it are quite the sight if you have a chance to have a look.
Oh, that's the first thing I'm going to be doing. It's just a shame you weren't sponsored by Kit Kat at the time.